Beginner gardeners, I'm back. Okay, this is the last video for the evening for me. I'm going to talk today about tonight this video about gardening methods, and I'm going to go over the three um, major types of gardening methods. Now, all of these have sub levels of different names and different ways, but I'm just going to give you the top three that you will be thinking about gardening. When you say I'm going to garden, these are the three ways that as a beginner you're going to think about starting. The top three are going to be traditional gardening, which is may also be called in-ground gardening. Um, Number two is I'm going to talk about container gardening. That's growing in pots. And thirdly, raised bed gardening. That's when you're building a frame and gardening inside of it. So let's talk about those three things just at the macro, the macro level. So I'm going to give you the pros and cons of each. So let's start off with the traditional. Okay, let's go. I want to start gardening. I have a little bit of a backyard. I can go the traditional way. Traditional way, here's some of that's in ground. So that means here's some of the pros, the advantages. It's the easiest to start. Basically, you're just going outside and dig up your yard and plant seeds in it. Um, that's that's the basics of it. So it is the easiest to start. It's relatively cheap. You will need some gardening tools, like some shovels and garden rakes and things of that nature. But besides that, it's relatively cheap to start. Depending on how much land you have, you can actually grow a whole lot. So if you got acres of land, you can grow a ton, in ground. Um, those are the basic advantages of in ground. You can quickly get started. It's relatively cheap, and you can grow a ton depending on how much space that you want to use. The cons. Um, One is the most strenuous on the body to get started. You go out there and you're having to really dig up and plow up your ground, and you will have to do that every single year. You'll have to dig up and plow up, because once your ground settles over the winter time and everything like that and gets hard, you will have to dig it up and plow it up and break it up every single year. Um, you are dependent upon your area's soil. That's a disadvantage. Some places in the United States have excellent natural soil. Their soil is good. It's nice and dark, and it's rich and nutrient dense. But there are many places where it's very dry. It's sandy. Um, it's full of rocks. It's like clay. A lot of times those places don't have good nutrients in, and so your plants are not going to grow as well as they could unless you add an expense, which is you have to add amendments like some garden soils or some compost or some things like that to your ground and till them in, so that you can actually try to give your natural ground some life. And so it could take several years for you to actually get your ground to the point where it's not like the rest of the ground that's around it. So yeah, that is strenuous on your body, yes, and it's going to require space. So if you're like that urban gardener, you're like that home gardener, you're like, I don't have that much time, nor do I have a whole lot of space to grow. To me, I wouldn't choose this method if I didn't want to grow and if I didn't have a huge space. Okay, so that's in-ground traditional way. The second way method is container gardening. There are many advantages to container gardening. One, I believe it's actually the quickest to start. Where I said the in-ground is kind of the easiest to start because you just go outside and just dig it up. Um, Container gardening is actually the quickest to start because really you don't even have to dig. You go to the Walmart and you buy a pot, buy some potting soil, buy a plant start, go home, pour the soil inside the pot, make sure the pot has holes in the bottom of it, of course, stick the plant in the thing, mash the soil down and water it, and you're that's it. You started growing already, right? So it's the quickest to start. It's less strenuous on your body. You're not tilling when it's in the soil, I mean in the pot. You don't need a whole lot of space. This is an excellent advantage. So for some people, container gardening is all you're going to be able to do. Um, so you're going to, because you don't have a yard or you just have a balcony or something like that. So container gardening is all that you'll be able to do. Another advantage though is containers come in different shapes and sizes. I mean, you can use anything. I mean, you look on YouTube, people are growing in buckets. People are growing in 1 gallon jugs. I mean, you can grow in almost anything. And if you're using any kind of container, no matter what size it is, what shape it is, how round it is, how deep it is considered container gardening. So I mean, you can use different shape containers to maximize your space. So that's also good. You have less weed issues because it's not actually in the ground, and most times it's very high above the ground. You're not getting weed seeds falling in. Now you will have a few, but you'll be easy. It will be easy to take out. Um, it can be moved around depending on how you set your garden up. Um, if let's say you got a plant here and it's not, you realize it's not getting as much light, and you have a space to put it where you can give it more light, it's easier for you to move that container into that space, whereas in ground will not allow you to do certain things like that. Now here's some cons of the container gardening. You are limited to the amount of things that you're able to grow. Now I know you can grow a whole lot, but there is some limits. So you have to be realistic when you're growing in containers of how much you're going to be able to get. Also, containers will require you. They dry out faster. It's just the nature of the beast. Because you're growing in a pot, it's getting heat from all around the pot, so that moisture, that water that you put in, evaporates much faster. So you're definitely going to have to water more when you have container gardening, and you have to make sure the soil that you use is drains well, but also has the right retention as water retention as well, because you don't want it to hold too much water, because then certain plants will get rot. But you don't want it to lose water so fast, because then those plants aren't. It drains too fast, and not it won't give them the roots enough time to suck up. So you have to find a good balance for that, but that's not necessarily that difficult to do. So besides those two things, I mean, container gardening is pretty good. Now we got raised bed gardening, which is my favorite, which is what I recommend if you have some space. Um, the advantage: raised bed gardening, you are providing the source nutrients. So it's not dependent, your soil is not dependent on where you live, whether you have clay soil or rocky soil, it doesn't matter, because when you build your raised bed, you are putting in what you want So your soil to be, so you can start off with the best soil. Two, it allows, because it's right on top of the grass or right on top of the ground, you still get the abundance of other earthworms and microorganisms that are in your actual ground will uh, gravitate to your raised bed to bring more nutrients that way. Two, you can grow a lot in a little bit of space. Doesn't take much. Uh, it the weeding is, you have more weeds than container gardening, but less weeds than in-ground garden. So, and when you do get weeds in the raised bed, it's very easy to take them out. Um, it's very easy to harvest in raised bed gardening. Um, Raised beds can be designed. It's like when you're making a raised bed garden, you can design it to any way you want it, make it look very nice. Um, um, I just like raised bed gardening. Or, if you had a small space and you said, I want to grow a whole lot, but I don't want to dig up my entire yard, you could, or if you only had a little bit of yard and you say, I want to grow a whole lot, a raised bed is going to give you the ability to grow the maximum amount of food in your small space. So that's what I like it. Disadvantage of a raised bed, being honest, when your first year, when you first put the raised bed together, it can be expensive. You have to buy the materials, and once you put your raised beds together, depending on the size, you have to fill them. And when you fill them, it can be expensive. Um, buying compost by the cubic yard or by the yard, or if you say I'm just going to buy it by the bag, that stuff can, after a while, it can get very, very expensive. So now there's ways around it, but if for the average beginner they don't know, it can be expensive. Now that cost goes down because over time the nutrients that you put in this raised bed still remains in this raised bed, and so you can build an ecosystem in this thing, and then you know it decreases the amount of soil in this box will decrease over the year, but really the next year all you're doing is topping it off. So it's not like you have to buy a whole large amount again to fill it up. So your initial year is going to be very expensive. Going after that, the cost decreases a lot. But like where container gardening, all your nutrients and everything that you put into that soil basically after a while drains out from the bottom of the container, leaving at the end of the season the soil that's in that container is basically devoid of any nutrients. It's just done because the plants have sucked up all the nutrients in that soil. In your raised bed, there's the nutrients and stuff is still there, and so really you're just topping it off every year. But it can get expensive. Two, it's less strenuous than in-ground gardening, but it does require you to do a little muscle, especially your initial year. Um, you will need some tools. Unlike the container gardening, you will, need some shovels and some things like that to turn over the soils, to do some things. So you will need some tools like that. Um, and it requires more watering than the in-ground does. So it doesn't require as much as the container, but you will have to keep it um, well watered. So those are your three ways that you have to decide. Which one are you going to choose? Which one best suits you, for you to, if you're an absolute beginner and you're just like, I don't want to go too far, I would say start with a container. Start with about two or three if you have the space. Try to grow something in those two or three containers. If you say, well, I just want to start small, but I do have the space and I want to launch out into the deep, I would say start with a one raised bed, 4 feet by 4 square, and you can grow a good amount of food in that. All right. So if you guys got any questions, make sure you let me know. All right. Let's get to growing this year.